Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you call home. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All of our attendees are currently on mute, but we like to keep our webinars as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter those questions in the questions section of your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll try and answer those as they come in. We'll also be ending the session with a live Q&A. So let's get started here. Thanks so much for joining us for the webinar today, Winning the Battle Against Data Deluge and Alarm Fatigue. I'm Kyle Benaz, the Director of Marketing at Netreo, and I'll be your host today. As mentioned, please send any and all questions, and I'll make sure we get those answered for you. I'm joined today by James Mancini, Netreo co-founder and principal solution architect. James, thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to hear what you have to share with us, considering alert deluge is one of the most common challenges we hear about when speaking with IT teams. So with that, I'll pass the ball to you.
Thanks, Kyle. So we're not going to sugarcoat it. Network management is usually a drag, and there's a few common pain points that most organizations can relate to. The most common ones that we see are a lack of a single view into all of IT, over alerting, and the admin overhead required to keep the whole thing working. So today, we're going to talk about how to alleviate what is usually the most painful of these, the problems and fatigue caused by over alerting in the environment. So some of the most common things we see in this area are things I'm sure you can all relate to. Your inbox, phone, and chat apps are all exploding with notifications, sometimes hundreds or more a day. And at that rate, nobody can possibly hope to keep up with them, much less make progress on solving the underlying issues. Even organizations with complex monitoring systems in place are often stuck in firefighting mode, reacting to alarms as they occur without ever really getting on top of them. And in some cases, they're even missing real issues, sometimes because of a failure in the monitoring system configuration, and sometimes because the alert was lost in the avalanche of noise coming from the system. So what's causing the alert flood? Generally, it comes down to a few key things. The lack of a defined notification plan is a big one, and we'll talk about how best to solve that issue today. It leads directly into the next, which is over-configuring monitoring and alerts, because too many alerts is just as bad or worse than too few in many cases. We also see cases where customers just plug in a monitoring system and switch everything on at once, figuring it's best to see everything that's happening. But then they end up so buried in noise that they rarely get the insight that they're looking for. Our philosophy is that alerts should be restricted to only truly actionable items, things that drive a real-time response. One of the most common issues with alert management we see is that organizations get stuck in this firefighting mode, and they spend so much time putting out fires that it comes at the expense of dealing with real business needs and moving the organization forward. Even larger organizations with well-defined roles and a robust monitoring strategy can fall into this trap, especially if they're only getting reactive alarms. A smoke detector is important, but once it's going off and the building is burning, you're not going to have time to plan the sprinkler system. Another common cause we often see is little to no automation in use, which drives things like stale configurations and slow response times. Many systems also rely on static alerts, which don't adapt to changing conditions, and they'll miss important problems as they're emerging until there's already a major fire to put out. Lastly, a big driver of this problem is that many systems lack good reporting and long-term visibility. Some of the most popular network management tools today only save a week's worth of data, for example, and that's never going to get you the detailed reporting and trend data that will help you make your organization truly proactive so you can focus on prevention rather than just rushing from one fire to another. Another common reason for missing issues as they happen is a lack of a monitoring policy that defines what should be watched and how. And it can be driven by a failure to connect the development and production teams as well. So the production engineering support teams aren't even sure what the critical paths of a new application are when it's rolled out, which inevitably leads to missed configuration steps or gaps in the monitoring where new systems aren't being onboarded to the monitoring system correctly, a process that ideally should be fully automated rather than manual. So how do we get all this under control? The first step is to create a monitoring policy if you don't have one already, because this lays the groundwork for what should be monitored and how to monitor it. This is important because often technical teams start with a monitor everything approach, and this inevitably leads to millions of unread alert messages for things that don't trigger a response, overwhelming the teams in useless noise instead of real actionable information. It should also clearly outline the action and escalation contacts, timeframes, and methods of communication to use. You should make sure also to build in a timeline to revisit this plan regularly. This is going to depend somewhat on how fast the environment is evolving. Some organizations might get away with doing this annually, but the rapid pace of change in many industries might mean that you need quarterly or even monthly revisions to keep up with everything changing in the environment. So let's talk about some easy ways to accomplish that. One of the first steps is to define your priority levels so you can have a clear model for when to escalate a particular issue and what defines a full-blown crisis from a minor issue. So here's a simplified model we often use to help customers develop their own priority system in case you don't have a well-defined way to do that yet. So it starts with defining what we call impact metrics. So in this case, how severely the users are impacted, and then plotting that against how many users are affected. In other words, are the users unable to work entirely? Is the factory stopped? Are orders not going out? Or is it something more minor, like a routine task takes a few seconds longer to complete, or creating delays in an internal monthly report? Once we've got a clear picture for what's important, it's easy then to divide those graphs into zones by priority. And those priorities can then drive our action plan, like who should get notified and how quickly when something isn't responding, and what the escalation timing and paths should be for those items. The key point here is that if everything is critical, nothing is critical. If everything's a priority one, drop everything emergency, then there's never really any way to escalate that. And the problem is that very quickly people realize that some of these drop everything emergencies aren't that critical, and you start getting into a lot of dropped balls and missed opportunities. So when we define this action plan, we need to be able to rely on it for detailed instructions during a crisis. So at a minimum, we need to define exactly who should be notified and exactly what methods should be used to notify them, both for initial notifications, as well as defining a timeline for escalation. So how long should an outage persist before someone in management gets notified? This is also going to depend heavily on the scope of the outage and the priority that we just set. So we need to make sure that the plan clearly outlines exactly what will be communicated to whom when something goes wrong. Remember that badly worded notifications are very counterproductive because it can cause people to panic or to take incorrect actions. We also need to factor in things like time of day and day of week. Some enterprises are true 7 by 24 by 365 operations, but many aren't, or at least not for all the resources that they need to monitor. When a system goes down after hours, but isn't going to be needed until the next day, what's the process for that? When is someone available to work the problem? A different response to an outage that happens during off hours is a reasonable, appropriate approach in many cases, and the monitoring plan should reflect that. Lastly, don't forget to see what you can automate, because automating the initial response to an incident to do things like reboot a server or spin up more cloud resources or restart services can drastically reduce your mean time to repair and often fix some of these problems before you even have to intervene manually at all. During a mass outage, we also need to be able to reliably communicate what's going on to all of the different teams and stakeholders. So the monitoring plan should address exactly how you're going to get notifications out to people, especially factoring in the difficulties that are inherent in a mass outage. So for example, email and SMS are usually the foundation that notifications are based on, but those may be impacted during a crisis or simply saturated with alerts and notifications if we haven't fully implemented the techniques we've talked about to minimize them. So we should consider some alternative methods of notification as well. For example, mobile app push notifications take a path that's entirely separate from email, and these can even be initiated from the cloud, so the state of your internal networks or systems won't affect it. You can also use things like API integration into team communications platforms, like Slack or Teams, to make sure that all of the different members of the team are aware of what's being done when and by whom. We should also try to leverage those existing operational systems as best we can. So this can help to eliminate redundant alarm sources and consolidate instances into a single manageable number of alerts. So integrating with things like notification managers can simplify on-call schedules and provide a way to distribute alerts that's not dependent on internal mail infrastructure, like OpsGenie or PagerDuty. Many organizations will also be using a ticketing or ITSM system like ServiceNow, and you're going to want to make sure that the plan includes how these tools should be used during a crisis and how to integrate them with your monitoring and alerting systems. You should decide whether or not these systems will be responsible for sending out notifications or whether that's something that the monitoring system itself is going to be doing so that you're not getting duplicate alerts, and you can make sure that you've got a clean workflow for your operators to be able to resolve these issues. You should also consider integrating monitoring systems with things like CMDB or inventory systems, because this helps make sure that new systems get monitored quickly, but it also helps by making sure that decommissioned systems or configuration changes aren't triggering false alarms. So one great way to reduce alert volume is to make sure you're only getting the alerts you actually need. And the best way to do that is to make sure you're reserving these kinds of active notifications for what we call actionable items only. So the idea here is that if we're not going to react to a notification as soon as it comes in, we shouldn't be alerting on it. For example, if I'm getting an alert when my hard drive reaches 90% utilization, but I'm just sort of ignoring it because it's not urgent, two things are going to happen. First, sooner or later, you're going to get a server failure because you forgot to circle back on that alert before the drive filled up. And second, you're conditioning yourself and your teams to ignore alerts. And someone someday will inevitably ignore the wrong one, and you're going to have a major problem on your hands. So instead, what we should be doing is limiting the number of alerts that we send and configuring reports to stay informed. So for example, every morning I get a list of servers with the lowest free drive space. I know if I deal with the top few entries on that list, I get to sleep through the night. I never have to get that drop everything and fix this emergency alert. This same concept can apply to most of the different kinds of performance thresholds you're monitoring that aren't business impacting. Are you going to drop everything for a CPU on a system? Probably not. So making sure that you understand which alerts are truly critical and only alerting on those is going to streamline the workflow considerably. But a key point for success in this is to make sure that all of those reports are scheduled and automated so that nothing gets missed. And our approach is to give you a really easy way to accomplish that, directly within the platform without having to use scripting or, external tools to create and automate those reports. So let's look at a few examples of alerts to see what's actually actionable. So if I get a high CPU utilization alarm, is that an actionable item? I mean, probably not. I'm not going to drop everything and go do something about that server that's got a high CPU right now, unless maybe the CPU's been stuck there for a while. So our approach is to let you set a delay for these types of alerts. So for example, it won't generate an alarm until it's been over 95% for some length of time. If my SQL server pegs the CPU, that's probably normal and I don't want to get that alarm. But if it's been pegged for 30 minutes, I probably have a job I have to go kill, and that becomes a much more important item. If a switch port goes down, is that something that is actionable? Well, it is if it's plugged into something important, so it's generally yes, and it's a good candidate for an immediate alarm. But what if this interface is part of a port channel, or it's just one server in a large cluster, or it's a redundant backup link? That might warrant a different priority or a different method of notification that doesn't require a drop everything and fix this response. So consider this when you're setting up those alarms. What about if an internal application goes down? That's generally a big yes, but you might also want to try automating a response as well. So you can, for example, have your Netreo try to restart the service or reboot the server to get things up faster, even while you're notifying your operations center. A great way to get control of the amounts of alerts being sent is to integrate automation. And automation comes in a few flavors. The first place to look at is automating the response to alerts so we can eliminate the need to send a notification at all sometimes. So you can link in vendor APIs, for example, like webhooks, or launch scripted actions through PowerShell or SSH to do things like restart or clear a port, retest an application, or even dump real-time diagnostics in response to an issue. We allow you to control those commands manually through operator intervention as well. So if you want to add a click to restart server function that goes directly into the web interface of the monitoring system, so my operators can from that just click a button that executes that automation and limit the access to just administrators, there's an easy way to do that in our platform. However, keep in mind if you're automating a response, maintenance windows become critical to use. Otherwise, a scheduled software upgrade is not going to go like you expect because the monitoring system is going to start doing things in the background. Nothing is more frustrating than shutting down your application for a planned upgrade and having the server suddenly reboot. We give you easy ways to create and schedule those maintenance windows to make that seamless, and also APIs to integrate that with your change management processes so that those sorts of things don't happen. As I mentioned earlier, a big part of keeping the lines of communication clear is making sure to reduce the volume of noisy alerts that might be coming in during a crisis. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to take advantage of built-in technologies like root cause detection. Automated root cause detection can help a lot because it eliminates possible causes, and it can drastically reduce the number of alerts generated during a major incident, which is going to reduce distractions and avoid unneeded troubleshooting time or even parallel troubleshooting where you have multiple teams working the same problem from different angles when they don't really need to be. By configuring a topology into the tool or letting the tool discover a topology, we can determine that the reason all the remote devices at that location suddenly went unreachable is because of the WAN router going down. So instead of sending out notifications for every remote device separately, every switch, every server, every wireless access point at that location, instead I get a single alert that can point me directly to the WAN router as the cause of the problem and show me what else is being impacted by that outage. You can also use tools to help you tune those alerts, which will help you identify what I like to call noisy birds. It's the few configured alerts that are responsible for a disproportionate amount of alarms, or those where a small adjustment to sensitivity might be required. You can use things like our template baseline reports to see exactly which alerts are being generated by the configuration templates and make changes to those templates directly that will then automatically be rolled out to all of the devices where that template is applied. You should also consider leveraging technologies like AI and machine learning here. Our autopilot feature, for example, will automatically evaluate your monitoring configuration and templates, analyze alerting behavior and possible integration issues, and kind of automatically adjust thresholds to reduce false alarms or provide reports that allow you to do so easily and quickly. One of the best practice recommendations that we often give customers as well is to use distribution lists and not individual emails for alerts and automated reports. There's a few good reasons to do this, but one of the key ones is to better keep in sync with personnel changes. There's been more than a few incidents where a problem was detected by the monitoring system, but the alert went out to an abandoned or an invalid mailbox, and this can cause a significant delay in detecting and acting on the problem. It also allows you to create an easy historical archive of those automated reports and share them in a central location. So if I need to go back to the weekly performance reports from 2 years ago in September, they're easy to find and locate, even if the detailed data has been archived by now. One of the other keys to success in scaling is automation. So automating your monitoring lets you make sure that the monitoring system stays up to date, even when you're deploying resources dynamically across thousands of locations in multiple clouds. We provide a number of easy to use web-based APIs that allow you to link your provisioning process automation or CMDB directly into the monitoring configuration or automatically discover resources even if they're cloud-based resources. And once the platform locates those resources, we can drive that configuration forward using rules to define and identify the device type, category, applications, and templates that control every aspect of monitoring configuration with no administrative intervention required. We call this process auto configuration, and it comes with a set of rules to get started, which can easily be customized or create or have new ones created to fit into the environment. And you can use these to set device attributes like making sure that they are put in the right categories or sites or business workflows based on any of the device criteria, including things like what processes are running, what ports are open, what the device's name, or where it's located. And this makes sure that there's no manual provisioning process to get those devices into the right reports, get all the right settings and alerts applied to them, and get them into monitoring as quickly as possible so you're not running blind. These will automatically be applied to discovered devices, regardless of what method is used to add them in or what platform they're running on, and can also be reapplied as desired. So if you want to make sure everything stays locked to the configuration rules, you can very easily enforce that. Using those criteria set by the auto configuration engine, we then dynamically apply all of the relevant settings via a cascading template system. So this makes sure that all the different settings that we want on that device, like um, you know, a new SQL server comes online. We want to make sure it not only gets the basic Windows server settings, but it also gets all of the SQL specific application checks and settings and make sure the SQL team gets notified when there's a problem with it. And if the database has the word production in the name, we can add extra notifications if that's how you want to handle it. You can also use those templates to define the authentication, escalation, and active response automation actions. So it's designed to be really flexible. So it can meet the needs of a global enterprise size customer, but still be simple enough for a small IT department to use without a lot of training or dedicated personnel. These are all things that you can customize, not things that you have to hire consultants to handle for you. Detecting unusual behavior instead of relying just on static alarm settings is also a key way to get proactive with monitoring, find issues before they impact users, and reduce false alarms. So with Netreo, you can use anomaly detection to find changes in application behavior, and it can be applied at almost any level: CPU utilization, memory usage, running processes, even log messages. So if the application suddenly goes from 10 login failures an hour to 1,000, that last code deployment may not have gone quite as smoothly as we expected, but now we know exactly where to go to troubleshoot and fix that problem. We'll automatically build this baseline behavior model using the large volume of historical data we retain. automatically adapting the baseline as the environment changes and evolves. And anomalies can be detected based on changes in baseline behavior, looking at things like time of day of week, or even hour by hour. Finding those patterns in the data and then applying those alerts to them rather than manually requiring you to figure out what's normal for the environment and generate those baselines and reports. This allows you to find unexpected impacts as well, like a software change that causes unusual behavior in a CPU on a backend SQL server. One customer of ours discovered an issue where normally at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, the database server was running at 50 to 60%, but suddenly it was running at 15%. And it turns out that a software change to the user interface broke the CSS on a form deep within their application where the front end team didn't notice it, and customers weren't able to complete the orders properly. Now, that sort of anomaly is the kind of unusual behavior that would never trigger a static threshold, but in this case revealed the problem long before they noticed the sharp drop in orders and customer complaints that could have resulted from it. We also want to make sure, I'm sorry, I think this slide is duplicated. So a key point of having a successful monitoring plan is to make sure that it's being used and to stay on top of the monitoring system itself. So we want to make sure that our techs and engineers are acknowledging problems as they are dealt with. We don't want our monitoring screens to get flooded with alerts. A monitoring screen that's got tons of alerts all over it makes it very easy to miss a new critical issue. Alerts should be acted upon and acknowledged or corrected as soon as possible. It should not be acceptable to let alerts sit in the queue until the support team's regular working hours, for example. If the condition is acceptable during off hours, the alert should be generated only when it is not acceptable and when someone is available to work on the problem. Alerts that don't get addressed within a specific time frame should be automatically escalated to prevent these kind of problems from happening. And this really prevents that monitoring measles condition, where every time you load the monitoring screen, there's 500 red lights on it, and you can never really figure out what's new, what's a real problem, what's a false alarm that just hasn't been dealt with, or when something critical is happening in the system. It can make it really difficult to interpret those screens. Using maintenance windows for planned outages also helps this problem because it not only reduces the volume of alerts, it will also do things like clean up the dashboards and normalize your uptime reports. So a system that has no unplanned outages in a given month can show 100% uptime without having to manually adjust the reports or to write explanations to roll them up to senior management. Finally, don't ignore alerts. Ignoring alerts is a surefire way of getting into trouble. At some point, a mistake is going to be made, someone's going to ignore the wrong thing, and the problem's going to get out of control before you can really get a handle on it. So avoid the problem altogether by making sure non-actionable alerts are not even sent. You can also still use those automated reports to keep track of what's going on with those systems or to get notifications at the end of the day for later investigation. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kyle to wrap up and tell you a little bit about Netreo as a company for those of you who haven't worked with us before.
Yeah, thanks, James. I love the monitoring measles reference. I don't think I've heard that one before. So I see that many of you are not Netreo users, which is fantastic. So for the uninitiated, founded in 2000, Netreo has been in the business of full stack monitoring for over 2 decades. Users of the Netreo platform come from all over the globe in just about every industry you can think of. And the Netreo platform plays extremely well in industries that are highly regulated like finance, aerospace, and transportation, require high reliability and scalability like healthcare and life sciences, and have real-time mission criticality like emergency services. So backed by years of data and multiple patents, Netreo is recognized as an IT leader or a leader in IT management and monitoring. Customers recently named Netreo a high performer in G2 Crowd's enterprise monitoring, network monitoring, and IT alerting grid reports. Netreo is also the highest rated vendor based on customer reviews in the most recent Gartner Peer Insights Voice of the Customer report. So we have a few minutes left here, so let's open up the floor for some additional questions. And while we do that, I'm actually going to open up a poll. So let us know how we can help you further. So I'm going to launch this real quick. All right, so let's jump into the questions. So James, looks like the first one we have in here is, so when you deploy Netreo, what's the usual decrease in alerts that customers see?
Well, it's a little bit tricky to answer that question directly because it's going to depend somewhat on your environment and how complex that environment is. But in a lot of cases, we actually see customers tell us that they've managed to reduce the a number of alerts that they're having to deal with through their operations center by 50% or more, sometimes as much as 80%, just through automatic event correlation and the ability for the system to detect that topology to reduce false topology alerts where unreachable devices are sending alarms as opposed to devices that are actually having problems. And that can also go a long way towards limiting the amount of troubleshooting time that the teams have to spend finding the root cause of the problem. If you get 50 emails all at once, it's really difficult to figure out what happened first. Whereas if you get one email that says, hey, this switch went down, these 10 servers are now unavailable as a result, that's a much easier thing to process, and you know exactly where to route that and who needs to be working on the problem.
Awesome. Thanks, James. So another question we had in, so can you name a system unique functionality that only Netreo has against other monitoring tools?
Well, there's a few actually, but probably the most important one from an alerting and monitoring standpoint is that automatic event correlation that's built into the system. We do more of that in an automated fashion than I think any of the other systems out there do. It also allows us to, kind of fully automate the process of device onboarding. So what I mean by that is when a new device gets deployed, like somebody spins up a virtual machine within a cluster, we can not only automatically detect that new virtual machine and identify it and how it needs to be monitored, but based on things like the services that are running on it or the naming conventions, it can automatically be added into all the dashboards and reports. It can automatically have all those templates applied to it, and those templates can in turn control the alarming for those systems at a very granular level. So it automatically inherits all of that, event logic, all of that automatic correlation for events, and all of the necessary settings with a minimal administrative footprint.
Awesome. All right, so we have another question here. I think I'll field this one. So the question is, what's the swap/ASAP program? So the swap out program. So that's a program that we're running currently. If you're exploring a new monitoring tool or you don't have one in place, or actually if you're exploring a new monitoring tool, what we'll do is just let us know what you're currently paying your monitoring vendor or vendors as a whole. Tool consolidation is a big thing. A lot of companies are using way more tools than they even realize. But let us know what you're using and what you're paying for that, and we're happy to match that price and get Netreo up and running. On the ASAP program, so many of you are probably aware with the recent SolarWinds compromise. So that's our accelerated SolarWinds alternative program. So we're able to get you up and running with Netreo in 5 days to get you back to basic monitoring. If you've had to shut down those Orion servers, we'll get you fully implemented within 30 days. And we will also match that SolarWinds renewal or maintenance price. So James, another question here. So Netreo mentions AI ops capabilities. So how does AI ops play in alert reduction and data deluge?
So as I mentioned a little bit during the presentation, what the AIOps functionality that's related to that is called is autopilot. And what autopilot is really designed to do is to constantly evaluate the configuration of how your monitoring system is interacting with the devices in the environment. So it looks for things like devices that aren't responding correctly, or thresholds that are set too tightly and are generating too many alarms, or really anything in the environment that's not optimally configured to best practices. And it looks for things that it can recommend changes for. You can then look at that recommendation report and just click a fix button to fix those things based on the recommendations, or you can even empower the system to automatically correct specific problems that happen in the future. So for example, if you say, you get an alert from Autopilot that says, hey, this hard drive isn't collecting data right now for utilization. And then you realize, oh, that's right, I replaced that hard drive with a different one and I forgot to go in and repull the system. You can tell the system, hey, go ahead and do that rediscovery for me automatically from now on. So if you ever see that problem again, it just goes away. You never have to think about it. The system finds and corrects the problem individually. And then of course you can see a log of all of those kind of automated changes that have been done by the system. So it really helps to make the system a lot more self-tuning and self-healing, and to further reduce the amount of administrative load required to run and monitor the system.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll here, and we do have just a couple more questions. So James, the first one is what are the deployment options for Netreo?
So Netreo is available as either an on-premise appliance, where it's a virtual machine that you deploy with all of the software, database, operating system all pre-integrated. So there's no separate points of administration. You're not loading up a Windows license, loading up a SQL Server license, doing a bunch of manual configuration on those, then loading the software on top of it. It's designed to be fully integrated. So you just simply deploy the machine image in the environment, and it's up and ready to go in the space of a couple of minutes. You can also deploy it as a cloud-hosted system. So we offer it as a full SaaS solution, where all of your interaction, alerts, reports are coming from shared cloud infrastructure, where each individual customer is given an isolated segment, so that there's thorough security on all of the different customer data that's kept up there. But all of the access to it is available from anywhere on the internet. So if you have a lot of remote users and not really much of a centralized data center, or you're primarily cloud hosted and don't really have on-premise resources, that can be a great option for deploying as well.
Awesome, thanks, James. So I think we've got one more question here. So it's kind of a two-part question. So how is Netreo priced? Are there separate modules that have to be purchased?
So I personally try to stay out of pricing discussions as much as possible, but the way that the licensing and the pricing works is there's only a few additional capabilities beyond the everything package that the most basic level of Netreo includes. So any of the different Netreo deployment options include, all of the server monitoring, network monitoring, storage monitoring, artificial application, synthetic check monitoring. All of that functionality is kind of built in to the basic license. Then the add-ons are for things like scalability. So there's some certain kinds of advanced templated reports that are more relevant to things like government entities or MSPs that are available.
Oh, James, I think you might have cut out a little bit there, but I think I can help answer the rest of that question. Yeah. So as James was saying, the Netreo platform is it's an all-inclusive package. There are some additional things. There are some additional options that you can add. So like James was saying, for scalability, there's also Microsoft 365 Insight. So that is the whole Microsoft 365 suite monitoring that you can add on as well. But if you do have any questions on pricing, I see a lot of you filled out our poll. So we'll be reaching out to you shortly. We'll make sure that we get all of your questions answered. But beyond that, I think that wraps everything up today. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate you jumping on. Happy New Year to everyone, and have a great rest of your week.